Thank you, colleagues. Nice to see you all here today and looking forward to this productive meeting we'll have on Canada's energy sector. When the meeting is ready to start, thank you. As we begin this meeting, I just want to say that I call this meeting to order, and I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. So welcome to meeting number 21 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Natural Resources. Before we begin, I'll just review the guidelines as we usually do. I would ask all in-person participants to read the guidelines written on the updated cards on the table. These measures are in place to help prevent audio and feedback incidents, of which I have been an offender over the years, and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters, for whom I always speak too quickly. You will also notice a QR code on the card, which links to a short awareness video if you need it. Today's meeting, as you all know, is taking place in a hybrid format. And so I would just like to remind participants of the following points. Before speaking, just wait until I recognize you. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. For members participating in person or via Zoom, please raise your hand if you wish to speak. The committee clerks and I, and by which I mean really the committee clerks, will do the best we can to maintain a consolidated speaking order. And a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Well, what if this chair is fine with free and open? Okay. I shouldn't debate the rules right here with the clerk as the chair. Okay. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted on Thursday, September 18th, 2025, the committee shall commence its study of the management of Canadian energy exports.
That's a mistake. It's Canadian energy.
Gold beans. Okay. So let me start by being very pleased to welcome our witnesses. Normand Mousseau, professor at the Université de Montréal. Pierre-Olivier Pinault, professor and chair in energy sector management at HEC Montréal. All virtual witnesses have conducted a mandatory witness onboarding test. Thank you to the team who did that. You will each have 5 minutes for your opening remarks, witnesses, after which we will open the floor to questions. So let's begin, colleagues. Mr. Mousseau, you have the floor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation. In 2024, Canada exported approximately 4.5 million barrels a day, 8.8 billion cubic feet of natural gas, and 36 terawatt hours of electricity, the vast majority of which went to the U.S. These exports are the result of numerous independent players, largely owned by foreign interests. Though Canada ranks among the largest exporting countries for energy in the world, its ownership and production structure, as well as its markets, which are dominated by a single customer, mean that Canada plays a marginal role in global and regional energy prices. And despite the recent commissioning of two major infrastructure projects, the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the LNG Canada terminal. So, on the world stage, Canada is not an energy superpower, but simply a major producer and exporter of energy products. Despite recent announcements, Canada's position on the international energy scene is unlikely to change in the coming years. To understand this, let's consider the main energy export products. First, electricity. While a few provinces have been able to take advantage of low hydroelectricity prices to export significant amounts to the U.S., new electricity supplies in Canada do not offer a significant competitive advantage over those in the United States. That's because the technologies used for nuclear, wind, solar, photovoltaic, and battery storage are largely sourced from abroad. And thus, Canada pays the same price for its new production infrastructure as the rest of the world. Except for some cases that benefit from specific advantages, we cannot expect electricity to be a major export product. I'd say the same is true for the potential mass export of green hydrogen, for which no convincing business model has yet been produced. Worse still, while Canada was once at the forefront of electricity production and its use, this is no longer the case. Canada has therefore fallen completely behind in renewable energy production and storage technologies, as well as in the electrical technologies that are transforming the planet today. As for natural gas production in the U.S. is expected to remain strong in the coming years, making it unlikely that exports will significantly increase to the U.S. However, except perhaps for LNG ports multiplying in the U.S., or ports that might be open to LNG exports, there will be an upward pressure on the price of natural gas. The commissioning of Phase 1 of LNG Canada, whose export capacity of 14 million tonnes a year represents some 10% of natural gas production in Western Canada, could also lead to increased production and higher prices. However, even including future projects on the West Coast, Canada is expected to remain a second-tier player in natural gas, far behind the US, Australia, and Qatar, with no real ability to influence global prices. Canada is therefore not an energy superpower there either, and production capacity could soon exceed demand. This in Canada could lead to a fall in the value of natural gas. So Canada is a major oil exporter. Its markets are not very diversified, with most of its oil production going to the U.S., and that partly explains the current $16 USD difference between Western Canada Select and West Texas Intermediate. This is unlikely to change quickly, despite a new pipeline with almost 900,000 barrels a day in capacity. Nonetheless, only 270,000 barrels per day of oil were shipped to Asian markets in the first 9 months of 2025. It's difficult to see how private pipeline projects connecting Alberta wells to the Pacific could get off the ground, because Trans Mountain is not able to charge the actual cost of transporting oil and recovers little more than its operating costs and has no hope of recouping construction costs. Then we come to how demand is changing. The rest of the world outside North America is accelerating electric technologies in transportation, building and industry, relying on wind, solar, photovoltaic, and batteries. These transformations are already reducing the historical demand growth for fossil fuels and could soon impose a net reduction in demand, significantly affecting the value of Canadian investments in fossil fuel production and transportation infrastructure. So, in brief, despite its significant energy production, Canada is not an energy superpower. As we said, the situation is unlikely to change in the coming years. On the contrary, without a real policy for the adoption, mastery, and development of modern technologies based on renewable energies and electricity, Canada could well become increasingly less and less important globally in the energy sector. Thank you.
Thank you to the witness. And just so colleagues are aware, but I think it was well worth it. We just went an extra, 17 seconds over there. But I hope that all colleagues support that decision on my part to let the witness finish. So appreciate that, Monsieur Mousseau and Monsieur Pino. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to speak in front of this committee. Normand set the stage for many points that could be shared, but I'll reiterate the fact that Canada is a very large energy producer, especially in oil. When you look at the energy exports across Canada in 2024, 25% of all of our exports were energy products, largely dominated by oil. Crude oil, 19% of our exports are crude oil exports. But what is interesting is not only the 2024 picture and the current picture, but the evolution over the years. We have a diverse portfolio of energy products that we do export. Normand has mentioned electricity, oil, natural gas, but we should also realize that we export a large amount of coal. Actually, coal is more important in our exports than electricity. And we also export uranium products, nuclear fuel, which is also, overall not that significant, but still we are a major uranium producer, and we do export a significant amount. I'll go over the last 20 years or even slightly more, 30 years of exports to see that, in the 80s and 90s, Canada was, Canadian exports were not that dependent on energy exports. So around 10% of our exports were based on energy products. From 2000 to 2010, the rise of the oil sands production and the rise in prices, both for natural gas and crude oil, made of hydrocarbons export more significant in our energy exports. But then 2008, with the financial crisis hit, and then oil prices dropped, and that resulted in significant losses in terms of revenues for oil exporters. And after 2008, natural gas was not anymore a major source of export revenues because of the shale gas revolution in the US. Shale gas prices or natural gas prices have never really recovered from the growth of shale gas. So while from 2000 to 2010, natural gas and oil were almost equivalent in terms of export revenues, they've totally dropped after natural gas revenues have dropped and have never recovered in terms of importance in our energy exports. Oil prices did recover until 2014, but then again, with the growth of shale oil in the US, then the global prices for oil decreased, and then again, oil export revenues for Canadian exports dropped again because of this very significant drop in prices. Price recovered, but again, in 2020, the COVID pandemic hit prices again, and oil revenues from exports dropped again. They've recovered, but then since 2022, prices have been declining because of the world overproduction of oil. So we are in a situation in Canada where, yes, oil, because of the growth of production across Canada, has been increasing. Prices are fluctuating, hugely hitting especially Alberta, which is, as you know, the largest oil producer in province in Canada. But making the Alberta economy much at risk because of the vulnerability on oil prices. And then 3 times in the last 20 years, oil prices have significantly dropped, hurting the Alberta economy, particularly because of its dependence on oil. So there are, so as Normand said, and I won't repeat, we are not a significant energy superpower despite our extremely large production because of our market that is split across different provinces, a lot of players, and dependence on the US. So what are the barriers to the Canadian energy exports? I would say the first one is the low world prices and higher production cost of Canadian oil. So these low prices don't really don't provide a prospect for a huge increase in the future. The limited growth, the second barrier is really the limited growth in demand in oil. Oil demand and actually diesel demand and gasoline demand are already declining in China. So when China and Europe have a declining diesel and gasoline demand, then we should be worried about the future prospect of our markets for oil.
We're just a bit over your time. I desperately do want you to finish the recommendations. Could you wrap up that very quickly, and then we'll move to questions, and I'm confident you'll get the option to expand on your recommendations.
So my recommendation is really to move on from oil exports orientation to a more to develop sector, developing our economy on energy productivity, reducing our consumption to make the country more productive and developing sustainable markets in other products than just hydrocarbon products.
Thank you, Monsieur Pinault. So thank you to both the witnesses.
Pardon, Madame la Présidente. Juste un petit...
If I may, Madam Chair, a minor point of order. I do love my friends, the interpreters. They're absolute champions. But when you say shale gas and shale oil, it's schiste in French. It is not Shell, the company, but schiste bitumineux and huile de schiste.
Effectivement, ce sont deux.
Merci, Mr. Simard. So we'll go to our first round of questions, and we will start with Monsieur Mellet.
Question pour Monsieur Mousseau, professeur.
Question for Mr. Mousseau, professor at the Université de Montréal. Thank you for being with us this morning. You've often talked about the importance of biomass as an energy source and the need to further develop the Canadian market. Could you explain the essential role that biomass plays in the Canadian market and especially how we could develop the biomass industry in order to increase our energy independence?
Merci pour la question. Donc,
Thank you for the question. Biomass is highly diverse across Canada. In the prairies, for example, biomass is used primarily to produce ethanol and biodiesel. And in British Columbia, Quebec, and the Maritimes, it's to produce biomass granules for export. A great deal of forest waste is also used in the pulp and paper industry. So bark is burned to produce energy. There's no real structure apart from biofuels, that is. We don't have a real structured way of enhancing the value of the biomass. We published a report with Roberta Dagger where we highlighted the issues of lack of information, lack of coordination, and areas in which we're not very strategic in how we use biomass. Biomass may be marginal in a global energy use, representing only about 5 to 7%, but could become extremely useful if we had a genuine strategy and policy, a federal policy that would make it possible to use the right biomass in the right place. Biofuels are not the best way of going, generally speaking. In vehicles, for example, it's not necessarily the best way of using the energy biomass. Who are the champions in the boreal forests, for example? Well, in Northern Europe, we're seeing very sophisticated forest waste management where a great deal of biomass is used for industry. They try to enhance the value of their waste. Enhance, rather, the value of their waste. Current regulations, are they hindering or helping the use of biomass in Canada? I don't think it's so much a regulation issue as a lack of coherence. Biomass players, if we look at biomass granules, it's basically exported from Canada. So why are we sending those granules to Austria? It's because we haven't created markets here. We're not fostering its use to displace products like diesel in the regions or heating oil in the regions. In electrifying, for example, you can increase your resilience with heating. So we don't have a structured way of using biomass. I've been participating in conventions for years, and we haven't been doing what we should over the past 15 years.
Which international models should Canada study to accelerate the development of biomass, and what distinguishes these countries from others around the world?
So we see in Europe, Northern Europe in particular, for the same climate, they have a much better view of how we structure the use of biomass for industry, for heat district, for example. In Canada, there's no real policy, so the actors are more or less trying to fight and survive by themselves without any visions, without any strategy that would allow planning and investments and modernization of this industry.
What would be the main reasons? You say the last 20 years Canada has been declassified as a leader in energy. What are the main causes, or what should be done to rectify?
So you both know you've got about a minute and a half.
If you look at electricity, we are missing the revolution. We are not there. We were there 30 years ago in new technologies. Now, if you look at nuclear, we'll import the nuclear industry. If you look at electricity, we are not there. In oil and gas, the main issue is that we have one client, and we are our production is very scattered. There's a lot of players in the production, and so it's not possible to have the impact we see of other countries who have a nationalized gas and oil industry, where they can much more control, import and export, and play on prices, for example.
Okay. You talked of an interesting, when you discussed the transportation of oil on the Trans Mountain, is it the same issue when oil goes through the pipeline to the United States?
No, because those are older pipelines, so the cost have already been amortized, and it's included in the cost of transport. For Trans Mountain, if you look at the prices, essentially we've subsidized it at the level of $7 a barrel at the moment, because that would be the interest only on the debt, without including any additional revenue or profit for the company.
Merci, Monsieur Mousseau.
Merci.
13 seconds in case you want to wrap up, Monsieur Millet. Anything? Great. So for 6 minutes, the next round of questioning will be from Monsieur Gay. Or I should call you Minister, or what should I call you? Not just Monsieur, but go ahead.
Good or bad?
Ça va faire. Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Mousseau, you said something earlier at the very end of your remarks where you seemed to be advocating for major investment in modernizing the technology in Canada. I'm curious, and I'd like to give you some time to give us more details on what technologies you'd like to see modernized. What were you talking about exactly? And secondly, would the tax credits for clean energy announced by the government be helpful? Mr. Pinault might be able to add something to that. Thank you. The Trottier Institute published a report on that in October. Transportation technology, for example, we see that transportation in the world is being electrified. Canada is not present in that technological field. Canada could be a leader in road transportation, given that we have mines and so on. Canada could develop know-how. Industrial heat pumps in the manufacturing sector and in agri-food, or in the world, there is no know-how, there's no structure. It's still very small scale when it comes to installing and optimizing the technology. Canada, with a real program, could position itself and develop an effective service industry that could then move to export ideally. Canada is completely absent from that technological space in industry, in manufacturing, in construction, and in transportation. So the further we move ahead, the less it becomes possible for Canada to develop original niches. We can't just get there with tax credits. We need a genuine strategy, making it possible for investors to train people, to have lines with producers, and be able to optimize their operations. Basically, everything's demand-driven, so there's no structure. When heat pumps break in the industry, they're not replaced because we don't have a good, intelligent, smart ecosystem that can help Canada move into more modern technologies. Mr. Pinault? A major issue is on the consumption side. If we in Canada haven't developed expertise in maintenance and innovation, that's because we have been blessed by nature with a great deal of energy. So it's given us a culture of rather lackadaisical management of our energy resources. And that's what leads to our energy overconsumption. We tend not to be genuinely innovative. Yes, tax credits can help here and there. But basically, if Canada wants to position itself as a genuine energy superpower, it will need to have the courage to look at its own efficiency in how it consumes energy in different industries and seize opportunities to do more with less energy and stimulate efficient energy use. That will move us closer to the kind of innovation Normand's talking about, heat pumps and other technologies, and that whole shift will be supported and should be supported by an industrial strategy. In Quebec, for example, we could support electric buses or EV batteries, but there's always a risk because governments may choose outlets that look effective, but that can backfire. Canada will always win if it focuses on efficiency, and we have an enormous margin there because right now we are huge overconsumers of energy. In the past, you criticized Quebec for exporting electricity, and I think that's basically part of what you're saying. We should be more responsible in the energy we consume so that we can do more exporting. Tell us a bit about the Canadian grid. Are there advantages to connecting grids across Canada, and how would you see that happening? There'd be a huge advantage to interconnections among provinces and with the U.S., not so much to export net energy volumes, but to exchange more. Normand's right in what he says. Canada has a competitive advantage over other countries in the world. We have a great deal of space, wind, sun, and storage capacity. So our geography helps us produce more energy at lower cost. Interconnections would make it possible to exchange energy so that we can optimize production and consumption structures. And that's where there would be an advantage to interconnecting, not to export more, but to exchange more. Thank you.
Spectacular. So now we'll go for 6 minutes to Monsieur Simon.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Merci, messieurs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Your presentations remind me of discussions we've often had. What I'd like to do with you is to ensure that the report that you talked about in your opening remarks, I think they're very well synthesized. I'd like to come back to the current situation. The government is creating an equivalence between building oil and gas infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and economic resilience against a backdrop of tariffs that are hitting us hard. If I understand you correctly, and of course Mr. Musso was also very explicit on this, if I understood you correctly, Mr. Musso, the time of building infrastructure, their cost, and the world energy situation combined to mean that this would not be viable for oil and gas over time. No, it wouldn't be viable even in the very short term. We're seeing a slowdown in energy demand in those areas. And when it comes to gas, there are a tremendous number of projects outside Canada for LNG. So, in fact, there will be a surplus that could hit us quite quickly, very quickly. Mr. Pinault, you frequently talk about energy efficiency, but when it comes to oil and gas infrastructure, do you share Mr. Mousseau's view? Yes, absolutely. First of all, there's no private investor that seems eager to invest. The signals are clear. World oil prices are dropping. There's overproduction, so adding transportation infrastructure that costs a lot in a market where prices are dropping and volumes will very likely drop in the years to come, that taken in combination with world overproduction, that's not necessarily a good idea. I also agree with Normand on natural gas. LNG, there will be world overproduction, and it'll be very difficult to be competitive in that space as well. So in your view, a government that's well aware of how things are now, if it seeks greater economic resilience, might use its energy to might wish to use its energy to advantage. So what does it need to do? Mr. Mousseau, you talked about investing in new technologies. But what could the federal government do? What kind of strategy could it apply so that it could help put some wind in our economic sails? Energy efficiency needs to start with electrification and the modernization of technology. That's how we'll remain at the leading edge. And if we're going to do it, let's do it right and let's do it efficiently. We need to support electricity production with strategies that will bring down electricity prices. And there are provinces where strategies are not very efficient. So we might find ourselves with a counter-electrification movement. We need to electrify transportation and really move where the rest of the world is going, find niches where we're not dominant, like electric vehicles. We also have to find ways of developing Canadian niches that can help position us on the world stage. We need a strategy because just providing subsidies doesn't work. Mr. Pinault, on that? In the short and medium term, there's no risk to Canadian exports. Today's topic is really exports. Exports are not at risk. In fact, we've had record oil exports. Natural gas are also going to rise with the LNG terminal in BC. The problem is we're overly dependent on export revenue that will fluctuate and in the long term decline. So we can't bet on that with infrastructure that will, over the long term, not be viable. Canada has massive sources of energy, and we have to continue to focus on energy of the future, renewable energy, nuclear energy. We need to become better consumers, increase productivity. Economic growth focuses on productivity. If we can do more with what we have, we'll have value-added gains. We have to focus on that kind of productivity with technological innovation, which will be fostered by incentives to consume more effectively. Mr. Mousseau, do you have any analyses showing that investment in China and Europe on electrification, where it's going and what it might do to oil prices over the next 30 years? I thought I had seen this somewhere. China's massive investment in electricity does mean that their oil use will decline, and that will have an impact on supply and demand and lead to a drop in oil prices. Do you have any information on that? Well, nothing with me, but there are a lot of studies on the value of oil. The cost of oil is difficult to pin down because markets are not just dependent on supply and demand, but also production. If there's overproduction,
each one. So there'll be more opportunities to answer. for 5 minutes. And the first questioner will be Monsieur Martel.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is all very interesting. I'd like to know from either of you, Norway is a natural resource country, and from what we hear, it succeeded in effecting a good transition. Canada has the means it needs to achieve that. So why is Norway so far ahead of us? What have they done that we didn't do? Norway is an interesting case because Norway is sort of like a combination of Quebec and Alberta, high oil production and high electricity production. When we look at emissions per capita, they're not leaders in Europe in emissions or energy consumption. Both are quite high. Norway is a leader in transportation electrification. That's very real because they have a very strong policy. And what I was recommending for Canada is to impose very high taxes on the sale of gasoline-powered vehicles so that electric vehicles become more attractive to consumers. So it's by taxing vehicles and other products that use gasoline and oil that they have shifted public behavior and encouraged the adoption of cleaner technology. Please go ahead. Unlike Canada, Norway says, as long as people buy oil, I'm going to produce it and export it, but at the same time, in Norway, I'm going to modernize, electrify transportation, building heating systems, secondary processing of aluminium, for example. So Norway is much more productive for each gigajoule used in processing aluminium because they also make auto parts, and that's a lot of value added. But primarily, we need to start with modernizing the economy, modernizing the technology. Electrification has to go hand in hand with exporting oil while there are markets. That is reasonable in our view. The idea isn't to subsidize. If private investors want to invest in producing and exporting oil, let them do that. But at the same time, Canada has to support massive electrification of energy use. Well, we've been talking about electrification for a long time. But nothing seems to actually be happening that would lead us to believe we'll actually get there. It's difficult to get an electric power allocation for a given project, and lack of power is a concern. In artificial intelligence, this artificial intelligence is a huge energy user. At a conference, I heard that all kinds of energy will be important in the future because the need for energy will be so great with the way the world is going that we might find ourselves with an energy shortage. So is Canada aware of how much energy will be needed as artificial intelligence comes into greater use?
Il faut remettre les choses en perspective. Depuis 50 ans,
let's look at the overall picture. Societies are electrifying to an unprecedented degree. It's the energy form that is growing more quickly than all other forms of energy. A modern society needs electricity. You talked about AI. It's electricity that will increasingly power the services that we need. It won't just be electricity. We also need heat, and heat can be better provided by different kinds of technologies in some cases. But Whether we want it or not, electrification is a fundamental trend in every society that we could accelerate, but that is happening in any case because it's crucial.
Also, the member asked if there is enough energy to support electrification goals with regards to AI. So if you do have that answer, I'd encourage you to share it in the rest of the meeting or follow up in writing. So now we'll move on to the next questioner, which for 5 minutes will be Mr. Danko.
Thank you, Chair. Really appreciate this discussion this morning. Mr. Pino, I think it was you that just said that societies are electrifying to an unprecedented degree. And when I look at modern homes being built in Canada, that includes charging infrastructure for an EV, heat pump, heating and cooling, a stove and oven that's electric, induction, heat pump dryer, heat pump water heater. And then you tack on to that with electrification of industrial processes such as electric arc furnace, steel production, and as was mentioned, data centers and AI. Do you see this, and I think you've already said that this is a global trend, but I just wanted to be clear on the record that this is not an ideological choice, that societies around the world are moving this way because these technologies are better and cheaper and more efficient. Could you offer some comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a modern society relies on electricity for increasing the number of activities. So, and that's again, it's not an ideology. It's the fact. When you look at the share of electricity consumption in final consumption everywhere around the world, electricity has been growing for the last 50 years, even before anyone was starting to talk about climate change and the need to decarbonize. So, electricity is extremely efficient. So that's why societies have been adopting electricity increasingly. And that's why we should continue to move towards further electrification to gain productivity, to have a lot of to basically grow the economy. We will need more electricity and more generation. It will be hard to build because there is a lot of public resistance on new facilities, and the costs are also important. So we need to realize that cost of increasing the infrastructure will be significant. There will be also some public resistance over transmission lines or nuclear power plants or wind farms, solar farms. So that's why, again, we should look at every electrons we're using, consuming, and thinking, is it the most efficient way of using our electricity? And in Canada, we're very fortunate to be so inefficient because we can grow our supply within our current consumption because we benefit from such a high level of inefficiency. We can reduce our consumption in many sectors in a way that is productive and would avoid constructing more infrastructure, although we will still need more infrastructure in the future.
Monsieur Mousseau, you spoke about counter-electrification movement, and I think that we've certainly seen that in the United States, where the Trump administration has been anti-EV, has been all in on fossil fuels, and we're seeing echoes of that here in Canada as well. I was wondering if you can comment on where that leads to in global competitiveness if Western democracies are resisting that electrification. Where does that leave us from a competitive standpoint globally?
In fact, it's not. And I would say that contrary to what my colleague said, in Canada, the share of electricity in the total energy demand has not increased over the last 20 or 30 years. We are at 20%. If you go in China, it has moved from 15 to 32% in the last 20 years, which means that China is using more electric technologies than Canada in a more diverse way. And that means that we're still using the same technology largely as we were using 30 years ago in Canada, which is in industry. Of course, there's a bit more heat pumps, but natural gas is still dominating in heating in a lot of places in Canada. Industry has not electrified as massively as other countries. So that means, and this electrification is also a way of automatizing, of making better product, of making better use of energy. Electricity is much more efficient than gas or petrol just by the thermodynamic nature of it. And so that's where we are lacking in Canada. We have not taken over at the right scale the technologies. And Canada is not moving forward. So in that sense, we're very close to the US. If you look at the EV, there's been a large pullback in Canada, very similar to what we see in the US.
Thank you. And just last question in your, maybe in a brief, is if we should be burning fossil fuels to generate electricity, or if it's more productive, if the rest of the world is going nuclear, wind, solar, battery storage, et cetera. Thank you.
I would say that technologies are going down in price in wind and solar and storage, so we should certainly move there. If we need electricity short term, we might burn some gasoline or some gas to be able to move forward in the technologies. But we have to understand that this is end of the line.
Thank you, colleagues. Hopefully you'll have a chance to expand further. Our next questioner will be for 2.5 minutes. Monsieur Simard.
Merci.
Thank you. I don't have much time, but I'd like to talk about the recommendations in the report. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if I understand you correctly, the government shouldn't be investing in gas and oil infrastructure. If the private sector wants to do so, that's fair enough. The government should be focusing on modern technologies that may be more in step with the kind of development we're seeing both in Europe and China. If you were to formulate recommendations, what might they look like? Well, it's not so much importing more technology. It's a question of structuring Canada's competitiveness and capacity. So the support and the strategies should be seen as ways of improving productivity and competitiveness in Canada by modernizing our energy use. I focus a lot on productivity. Canada has to improve productivity. That will help Canada to position itself in its economy. Any measures to improve productivity will lead to innovation, so we have to continue supporting R&D and experimentation and innovation, but this has to be seen in the global context that will lead entrepreneurs to move to innovation. Mr. Mousseau, this is a discussion we've already had. I'd like you to indicate to the committee, within a reasonable time frame, do you think we are in a position to develop EV batteries, for example, or batteries that will make it more efficient to use electricity in the coming years? Yes, Canada can focus not on lithium batteries. We're not competitive there, but in long-term batteries. There are few players in the world on long-duration batteries, but that requires taking risks, and we haven't been very good at that. We haven't been good at developing effective industrial strategies in Canada. So storage capacity will be needed and will exist, yes.
Chair's prerogative. We will go to Monsieur Mallette for 5 minutes, and then our colleague, Mr. Clark, has agreed that he would have 1 or 2 questions. 1 or 2? Yeah. Okay. Okay, great. So for 5 minutes to Monsieur Mallette.
Thank you. So a question to Monsieur Pinault, and then I'd like to also to hear from Monsieur Mousseau. So we talk of hydro energy, crude oil, natural gas. We have a vast resource of biomass in this country, which is a renewable energy. What could be an opportunity for Canada in this?
Well, definitely, we have a lot of biomass. We're not making the best use of it. I think the first thing, and Normand has alluded to that, is that we don't have a deep knowledge of our consumption of biomass and the different markets, different uses. So we should better know ourselves in terms of the different types of biomass, and we need to structure the market in such a way that investors in the biomass market have more confidence that their product will find a niche or a real market, so that they can invest. We've been very bad at producing biofuels. The government has been putting some biofuels requirements, but we haven't seen investment in biofuel refineries, ethanol or biodiesel proportionate to the increase in blending of biofuels in different fuels. So, and that's because it's hard to get the certainty for producers and to basically certainties on the supply and certainties on the output and sales. So we need to structure the market in such a way that there's more confidence for producers that their product will be able to find a market.
And I would say as we move to net zero, all the idea about the role of biomass for carbon sequestration could be very interesting for Canada as we're creating international markets for these kind of negative emission rights. So this is also something where Canada could lead because, again, this is an underdeveloped market at the world scene. So we need to test the technologies, to evaluate the geology, to evaluate the role on land and agriculture, and see whether Canada could really use biomass efficiently on that aspect.
Thank you. Well, it leads me to the question, to hear from both of you, what would be the first steps to grow this industry effectively in a way to create energy, but also to create jobs?
I mean, we need a real strategy to structure this capacity. We need visibility for the regulation. And also, I think we need to support in a very structured way also innovation, especially on on the negative emission side.
And we need a market environment where producers see the value of their products. And that's why a carbon tax is extremely important, because on biofuels, you wouldn't pay the carbon tax because it's considered carbon neutral for very good reasons. But without the presence of a carbon tax, then we give a subsidy to hydrocarbon, and this is unfair to the biomass market. So we need to structure the market in such a way that the right economic incentives are provided on a long-term basis to have certainty.
So where would this be competitively if we classify it, with coal, crude oil, electricity, natural gas, refined petroleum products, uranium and nuclear, where would it put us competitively?
Biomass is already competitive for heat, for example. If you have in regions, we are underusing biomass for heat production, for example. So in big centers, it's harder, but in regions close to where the biomass is produced, this is already competitive. Then if we're talking about biofuels, biogas, then the competitiveness comes in essentially to regulation. So you have to impose it because the costs are too high. But the reasons for this are environmental, and that's how we justify. So even without a price on carbon, for example, regulation on fuels, for example, clean fuels, plays this role to ensure to increase the value of these products.
Thank you.
30 seconds.
Monsieur Pinault?
I don't have much to add. I think, as Normand said, biofuels and biomass are already competitive in some markets. We need to structure. They don't benefit from big players, so we would need probably larger players to be able to structure the market and to make these efficiencies where we need. But as Normand said, in many regions, heating through biomass is good. I would say developing heat networks, district heating with biomass in many places, it does make a lot of sense. And that also is very good, not only from a competitive perspective, but from a resilience perspective, and to foster the local economies and local competitiveness. I think there's a very good match here.
Thank you. And we're just over so that you could finish that thought. So now, Mr. Clark.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I will be as brief as possible with my one question. I just wanted to
Mr. Pino, you've spoken quite a bit, both of you have, about the need for electrification and electricity generation. And to that end, I just wanted to highlight a major project that's being championed by my home province of Nova Scotia. That's Wind West. So this is a project that represents, at full build-out, up to 66 gigawatts of renewable electricity, which is 27% of our current national demand. A tremendous project with, I think, incredible potential around interties and all the things that have been discussed today. So, Mr. Pino, if you could just touch on that project in particular, what you think about it, and if you're unable to, and I know you're putting me on the spot on this one, just more generally, what your views might be on offshore wind as a potential electricity generation source in the short, medium, and long term for our country. Thank you.
I think wind west and offshore wind is very interesting and is a potential we should definitely look at, but we should look at it from a more integrated perspective and not from a Nova Scotia only perspective, but really from an Atlantic Canada perspective, including Quebec, and we should basically make sure that we do have all the interties to make sure that the surplus wind can move to eastern, well, to other provinces to the west of Nova Scotia, and then reciprocally that Nova Scotia can benefit because there will still be some hours with less wind from supply from other provinces. And if when we look more in a more integrated manner, then we can optimize these benefits. And so far, we've been unable to have this kind of regional planning in Atlantic Canada and across Canada in general. And we desperately need this kind of more general and joint regional planning to make sure that these investments are optimally sized and that the adequate transmission lines are built.
Thank you very much indeed. And to that point, that very salient point from the witness, I would just, of course, point out that this very committee recommended to the federal government to start with interties in 2017 or 18, and they've done nothing whatsoever. But thank you for that comment, and thank you to my colleague, Mr. Clark, for his concluding question. Thank you to the witnesses for your participation. I just want to make sure that you know that you can also submit input in writing. The committee will need to adopt that into the report. If you do that, if there are things additionally that you didn't get to speak to, that's an option for you. And of course, the more Canadians who participate in these sorts of debates and contribute to the public policy discussion, the better it is for our democracy and the better it is for government decisions ultimately. So thank you for all of your participation, and so that you know you have that follow-up option as well.
Merci.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So that is all the time for this panel today. And again, just like to thank the witnesses. As colleagues know now, we will suspend for a few minutes to welcome our next witnesses and maybe for me to run to the bathroom as fast as I can with my short legs. Soon, so please everybody take your seats as soon as possible. In particular, will move immediately to their seats. Like immediately, people. Yep, we'll get right. So, and look, I'll be patient with these liberals too to get to their seats. That means mine better get there faster. Yeah. So, without further ado, let me first introduce our two witnesses for Canadians for Affordable Energy, the Honourable Dan McTeague, who is president of that organization, and for the Macdonald Laurier Institute, Heather Exner-Perot, the Director of Energy, Natural Resources and Environment. All virtual witnesses have conducted a mandatory witness onboarding test. And I'm just going to make a few comments for the benefit of these witnesses who are not new, though. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, as you both are, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. And please mute yourself when you are not speaking. I recognize the hypocrisy in me saying those words, but anyway, here we are. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair, although I don't get sticky about that. You'll have 5 minutes each for your opening remarks, and then I'll open it up to the floor for questions. So, Honourable Mr. McTeague, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Well, what a pleasure it is to be here again, Madam Chair, and great to see you there, as well as my colleagues who I tip my hat to. I've been where you've been, and I can tell you it's not an easy job, but it's very much rewarding both before and after. I would also say that I see that the setting is a lot better than what we had to put up with 10, 20 years ago with plastered walls, some of it filled with asbestos. It seems that the facilities are a whole lot more amenable. And of course, we can meet virtually, which I think is just wonderful. Je ferai des commentaires ici en anglais, mais aussi je suis capable
I will be making my remarks in English, but I would be able to answer questions in French as well. Up to you.
Canadian energy exports reached $208.2 billion, accounting for 29% of all Canadian goods exported. In fact, natural resources are the only sector in which Canada has a trade surplus. Oil and gas exports alone totaled $188 billion in 2024. 94% of that went to the United States. Indeed, 89% of energy exports by value, roughly $184 billion, go to the U.S. annually. Canada supplies about 60% of U.S. crude imports and nearly 100% of all American natural gas imports. And that's a good thing for both sides. It provides jobs, economic vitality, and by stimulating domestic energy industry, affordable energy on both sides of the border, as well as including, of course, the United States and other players that are important to this role, which doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking for other markets to exploit. The more oil and gas we export, the stronger the economy will be right here in Canada. But the major limiting factor here is infrastructure. We have recently seen some positive developments on the score. As you know, in 2025, our first large-scale liquefied natural gas, the LNG plant export facility, went online in Kitimat, BC, enabling us to begin transporting material volumes of LNG to other markets, especially South Korea, Japan, and of course, China. And the Trans Mountain expansion completed in 2024 has provided some tidewater access from Alberta to the port of Vancouver in Burnaby. Still, that's a drop in the bucket, and it's difficult to imagine any major changes to this dynamic with Bill C-48, the Oil and Gas Tanker Moratorium Act, and Bill C-69, the No New Pipelines Act, which of course is still in force. This is an important opportunity for growth since hydrocarbon energy provides the vast majority, more than 80% of the world's primary energy needs, and global demand for these fuels is increasing, not decreasing. If Canada does not step up and supply the hydrocarbon energy for which the world is desperate, it will be supplied by poorly regulated, undemocratic, authoritarian countries that are less environmentally responsible than we are, not to mention less concerned with human rights. The war in Ukraine has exposed the dangers of over-reliance on one despotic trading partner. Most of the nations of Europe would have happily swapped Canadian oil and gas for the Russian products that they had to buy. And a nation like India, which of course has been very much in the news these days, both in the United States and here in Canada, which imports half of its natural gas and nearly all of its oil, is still trying to wean itself off Russian energy. They would be an ideal customer, I think, for Canadians, for Canada and for Canadians, if we indeed had the capacity and the willingness to step in and fill that void. There would be environmental benefits, to be sure, that in doing all this, as well as economic ones, enabling those nations that are still extremely reliant on coal to reduce emissions and improve air quality by transitioning to our natural gas. The fact of the matter is, if we were to follow the advice of the net zero obsessed anti-fossil fuel activists and the leave it in the ground mantra, global emissions would increase along with energy prices, and the Canadian economy would indeed suffer. Energy is Canada's leading export sector, and defending and expanding our energy exports is necessary for paying down things like our national debt, strengthening our dollar, and safeguarding our sovereignty. Of course, it also means increasing our energy exports would enable us to increase our global influence, as well as the energy security of all our allies and trading partners. But most importantly, it would enable us to bring down the elevated costs of living, which is making it so difficult for Canadians to heat our homes on a day like today in Eastern Canada, gas up our cars, and pay for the basic necessities of life. I'm here for your questions. Thank you very much.
Exactly like a pro, right on time. Thank you, Honourable Mr. Matee.
Thank you.
So for the Macdonald Laurier Institute, Mrs. Exner-Perot, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, committee members, for the opportunity to speak to you today. This topic, energy exports, is critical to Canada's economy and to its global influence and power, and it's essential we better position ourselves for success. Canada is a world-class energy producer with well over a century of reserves of oil, gas, and uranium. To reiterate what Mr. McTeague said, Canadian energy exports are worth over $200 billion, about 90% of which is oil and gas. According to NRCan, in 2024, oil and gas comprised 26% of Canadian exports. I will focus my remarks on oil and gas, but would be pleased to further discuss uranium, electricity, propane, and coal during questions. I would just note that Canada has recently become as likely to import as export electricity, a stunning and unfortunate turn of events, and this state of affairs deserves much more attention. Until 2024, Canadian oil and gas exports went almost exclusively to the United States via pipeline. It is only with the startup of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and LNG Canada that we have become a global rather than a regional exporter. Although the cost overruns of TMX are well known, the pipeline itself has proven its worth again and again. It narrowed the differential, or the price difference between WCS and WTI crude oil benchmarks, by about $6 to $8 a barrel, adding billions in revenues, royalties, and taxes, even before accounting for the additional volumes we've been able to send to global markets. Those additional volumes are significant. Although Trans Mountain has not been in service for even 2 years, it is already running very full. Last week, it ran at about 825,000 barrels a day, or 92% full. This is despite very high tolls for Trans Mountain, which are more than double the cost of sending crude to the Midwest. Recent data shows that tolls were about Canadian $14.40 a barrel from Edmonton to Westridge in BC, but only $6.60 from Edmonton to Flanagan, Illinois. Our crude oil exports to the United States have now dropped from what used to be an average of about 97% of the total to just 84%. China accounts for about 10%, with the remainder going to countries including Spain, India, Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea. It's clear from Prime Minister Carney and Minister Hodgson's recent trips to China and India that there's an appetite for more Canadian oil and gas in Asia, and that this will be key to any trade diversification strategy we advance. Canadian oil and gas producers are world-class operators and will incrementally grow production and global market share when they get new pipeline space to fill. The situation today is relatively healthy. LNG Canada has started up its second train very recently and is still ramping up exports. Cedar and Woodfibre LNG are under construction. Silicium's LNG and LNG Canada Phase 2 are expected to reach a final investment decision in 2026. For pipelines, the near-term focus is on expanding what we already have. Enbridge has already announced optimizing of its main line to the United States of up to 400,000 barrels a day over 2 phases. Trans Mountain is planning an expansion of up to 360,000 barrels per day. Coastal GasLink was built to already accommodate LNG Canada Phase 2. So we need 2 new pipelines in the medium term. First is Prince Rupert Gas Transmission, which is already approved and on the major projects office list and is intended to serve Siliciums. And we can sequence that pipeline building in Northwest BC by planning to build the Northwest Coast Oil Pipeline, which Alberta is leading, right after PRGT is finished. That means we must get our ducks in a row now. We don't need a new million-barrel pipeline today or tomorrow, but we will need it around 2031 or 2032, and that absolutely means that the planning and execution must start now. Alberta and Canada should take the necessary steps to develop a route, submit a project, conduct the duty to consult, clear initial legal and regulatory hurdles, and financially de-risk a new oil pipeline through Indigenous loan guarantees to the point where a private proponent feels confident that the pipeline can be built in Canada in a reasonable amount of time and that we are once again a safe place to invest capital. Private proponents must consider Canada safe to invest in upstream production as well in order to fill these new oil and gas pipelines to reach new global markets. Although the rhetoric and focus on being an energy superpower is much improved, there are mixed signals coming from the policy side. For example, in methane regulations, carbon pricing, and Indigenous consent. These need to be addressed for us to meet the lofty goals Prime Minister Carney has set for us as a nation. Thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Exner-Perot, and to both witnesses. Now, I feel a bit awkward about this, but if colleagues will consent, okay. Thank you. So I will lead the first rounds of questions. Yes. Who's it? Claude, you can time check me. Well, the clerk, he'll keep me on track. He hasn't started the time yet, right?
No.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, let's start. Thank you to both witnesses for being here today. Why don't we start off the top with a point that both of you made about the necessity of infrastructure in order to stimulate investments so that products can actually be shipped. I'd invite you both to describe the approach to energy development in Canada by this same government during the past 11 years and exactly why it is that no private sector proponents are willing to propose intergovernmental, interjurisdictional pipelines for export, as two proponents did, but couldn't see the end to the end of the regulatory system. And could you please explain why the government regulatory framework is absolutely inextricably linked from a private sector proponent's determination of a business case?
I can start. So you're exactly right. There isn't a business case for a private proponent to build an export oil pipeline to the West Coast. Now, the people build pipelines every day in this country. There's a business case to build pipelines. There's a business case to expand pipelines. And I think the fact that Enbridge and Trans Mountain are both expanding their oil pipelines indicates there's indeed a market for growing oil production and exports. And we are building, probably likely to get FID for Prince Rupert Gas Transmission. So again, we will be building a new export pipeline. It just happens to be natural gas and totally within British Columbia, which means that it isn't under the regulation of the Canadian Energy Regulator. But for the oil pipeline, the cancellation of Northern Gateway after it had been approved when it needed a few more conditions met was absolutely the biggest red flag you could send to the international investment community and told them that Canada was not a safe jurisdiction, that it had a risk premium, and that you'd be better off putting your money anywhere else. Then Trans Mountain's ballooning of costs again, and all the legal issues that went happen, the delays that were easily imposed, the blockades, all that again told capital that we are not a safe jurisdiction to put their money for an oil pipeline. And so no CEO would go to their board and say, hey, we're going to invest 20 billion, 25 billion into an oil pipeline in Canada. With, as Dan pointed out, C-48 and oil tanker ban is still in place. So who's going to, put money into a pipeline when an oil tanker is still in place? And without some assurances, some signals, BC is again signaling that they intend to use their powers to do what they can to frustrate it, even if they don't have the power to stop it. So it's very important, and we've seen this happen with LNG, where there was political alignment. You did get the political signaling from both BC and Ottawa that this was encouraged. And as a result, you're seeing progress, you're seeing construction, you will see FID. We need to see that same level of support and regulatory certainty for the oil pipeline side.
And Mr. McTeague, maybe you can comment, and you can as well, Heather. There's been much talk about C5 fast tracking to build projects at speeds never seen before. And at the back of that bill, is a list of laws and regulations that therefore the Liberals admit block building because they want to create a workaround about it. But now we got a scenario where politicians are recommending to politicians projects. The government refuses to define the national interest. They've got an MOU, but actually nothing has happened at all. There will be a conditional approval probably sometime later, with major pieces still undone. Nothing at all has happened. You may want to make comments about whether or not this government is actually focusing on the fundamentals that need to be fixed for every private sector proponent, more than 60 of them stuck in front of federal regulators right now across natural resources. So if you have comments on whether or not the Liberals have actually effectively fixed the problem that they themselves have created, maybe you can comment on that. Mr. McTeague.
He's on mute.
I'm being told you're on mute,
Dan.
and I think we'll save your time here.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, no apologies. I do the same thing.
I think I've put on mute, but notwithstanding, I think the mixed signals that the government has given really confuses. I don't know of any other country in the world that has the energy prowess of Canada, third, fourth largest provable reserves in the world, that is required to decarbonize before it's able to get infrastructure built or get products to market. We impose this on ourselves. And while it might be interesting and very important in certain corners, it is leaving market and capital with an absolute definable decision on Canada, which is that it's too risky. I worked with GasBuddy during the period of time which the BC government took the position of using every tool in the toolbox to block the Trans Mountain pipeline. Kinder Morgan, a company prepared to spend the $6 billion out of its own pocket to build a pipeline we desperately needed, was chased away. And as a result, you and I wound up picking up the tab, $32 to $50 billion based on a number of estimates. The reality, I think, is that if we continue to say and condition the way in which we are prepared to build infrastructure in this country, then no one is going to be interested in doing this, save and except the Canadian government. Last time I checked, our financial situation is, to put it very bluntly, is very weak. And to suggest that somehow we should be trading away our most important, our most valuable golden goose, for what it's called, under the idea that we can't do these things, we shouldn't be doing these things, is a negative to the Canadian economy and people who are looking for work today, and governments that have a real problem with balancing their books in the way my government in the time, the 1990s, knew how to balance a book and understood very well the importance of building pipelines, building our energy infrastructure. Yes, that was the Jean-Claude St. Paul Martin government, of which I was a member.
Thank you. And even though I have 97 more questions, that's time for me. So we will move on to the next questioner, which for 6 minutes will be Mr. Hogan.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thanks to our witnesses as well. There is, of course, a growing opportunity. You and other witnesses have talked about how energy has become an increased part of Canada's exports, which I also do want to flag. Doesn't really suggest that exports are in decline in the energy sector, but we also need to be thinking about where the market is going. And I do believe even in a world that uses less oil, demand for Canadian oil can continue to grow. And I worked on Northern Gateway, I worked on Energy East, I worked on TMX, and I do think we need to be pretty honest with ourselves here. There are absolutely regulatory efficiencies to be found, and those need to be resolved. But there are also fundamental economic challenges. We're talking about going west over the mountains or going east over an entire country, greenfield construction. These are not the most economic solutions available to our oil and gas sector. This is a north-south continent. I mean, you see it in the pad system, you see it in existing infrastructure. Ms. Exner-Perot, you talked about tolls. It is challenging to say, go build something that's less economic and then we're going to toll you on it. So here's my quandary. Free markets are naturally going to gravitate towards that north-south market integration and that infrastructure. How do we incentivize east-west infrastructure, and how do we incentivize export infrastructure without badly distorting the market? And maybe we can start with you, Ms. Exner-Perot.
Well, that's a great question. I would say that Northern Gateway was free market led, and they did make that decision. They did have a route, and it was, initially approved to go into Kitimat. So there was a private market case to build that pipeline over mountains, a few years ago. Now, and Enbridge, has said itself, they spent almost $1 billion on that. They obviously saw that there was a business case. But now we're in a different position, to your point, and I think we are asking ourselves, we don't want to go more north-south. I mean, I haven't heard anyone say that they want to export less to the United States, but obviously the optionality of being able to send oil to other markets is very appealing, and obviously would give Canada a different, set of leverage and tools in the current geopolitical situation. So there's actually a national security, case to build to the West Coast. And the reason why we usually talk about the West Coast is because Asia is just simply a better market than going to the East Coast. It's much larger and it's growing much faster, and there's more opportunity to displace existing producers. So for me, it's obvious, and it's what's happening, is that we need to de-risk it to a point where a private proponent could take it to its board and get approved, and when it gets slammed by shareholders the very next day in the markets. And so I think what Alberta's doing, acting as proponent, getting over some of the initial hurdles, getting it listed on that major projects office, getting it designated as a nation building project, are the right moves. I think Alberta could spend, a lot of the time doing some of the initial duty to consult, has to be done anyways, and then waiting for the market to be ready. It's true, at $61 a barrel in 2026, the market isn't looking for a 1 million barrel pipeline from Canada, But we expect in 2028, 2029, the market will be looking for those barrels after the Trans Mountain expansion is optimized and is delivering its additional barrels. And so it's very important, since our Achilles heel is long timelines, that we do as much legwork as we can as Ottawa and as Edmonton to get that pipeline in a position for a final investment decision for a private proponent to take over.
Thank you. I totally take your point. I do think, however, Enbridge had a lot of sunk costs, and Enbridge also didn't have the benefit of seeing how much TMX cost and the complexity of some of the crossings, which does sort of get to the fundamental challenge. We need to be building these things. The Alberta-Canada MOU has a commitment to a West Coast pipeline. This is something that needs to be produced. I do just want to, again, flag, I'm just worried about how we do it in a way that doesn't distort a market, because we also want a free market. And I worry about exactly what's going to occur without really giving some thought to that. Mr. McTeague, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Mr. Hogan, very good points you've made here. And I too take your point about going south, because, of course, that's where refineries over the past 20 years have been reconfigured to take the heavier slates of oil, which Canada is well known for, as Venezuela was at one point, even Mexico to a large extent, until it discovered it had problems with its with the quality of its oil, both in terms of water and salt contamination. But this also speaks to the need for expanding the markets to meet what the IEA never been very big on the idea that we needed more hydrocarbons, but now admitting that yes, this is in fact going to go up. The question is, do we have the infrastructure, not just the pipeline, but do we also have the advanced cokers? Do we also have the upgraders? The cost that has to go into these things, more than just an MOU, which by some estimates, and I looked at the numbers earlier, costs of carbon sequestration, who's going to pay for that, as well as, of course, the actual costs of increasing the carbon consideration from $95 to $130. That could be an extra $10 a barrel, making Canadian oil less attractive from the get-go, and perhaps explaining why there hasn't been a stampede towards building any pipeline under these conditions.
That is the perfect lead into my next question. So in your opening remarks, you said if we don't produce, the production will come from countries that are, quote, poorly regulated, less environmentally responsible. So I'm trying to understand regulation and environmental responsibility. Is that something that our customers are concerned about internationally?
Well, I think they want the lowest price where they can get it, but they also want to make sure that it does meet the high standards. I mean, we produce a heavy slate of oil that's needed for things like diesel. The United States doesn't produce heavy oil, not to the extent that we do here in Canada. It's one of the reasons why it does import most of its imports that it does bring in. It comes from Canada, because you can't run your economy without diesel, without heavy oil. But
thank you, Mr. McTeague, and I just went over so that you could answer my colleague's question.
Sorry, Paulette.
Oh, thank you. Next round of questions for 6 minutes. We'll go to Mr. Simard.
Merci.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. I hope the interpretation is working. I'm very happy to see you again. Last time we spoke, during the study on critical minerals, you were extremely efficient at drawing an overall picture, more efficient perhaps than government colleagues. We may not share the same opinion, so I'll explain the direction of my questions. I want to understand the dynamic between building the infrastructure needed for commercializing gas and what I'm seeing today as, in my opinion, the absence of a clear signal from private business, the private sector. The last oil infrastructure built in Canada was Trans Mountain, $34 billion in public money. And as far as I know, there's still a $7 per barrel subsidy from the government. So businesses don't want to pay the price for using the pipeline. When I look at projections, what I'm seeing is people saying that in 20, 30, or 40 years in the future, China and Europe will drastically reduce their oil use. So how can a private company decide to invest billions in an infrastructure that will be ready in, say, 10 years and still believe it will be profitable? I don't see the rationale there. the reasoning. So, as I might put it in bad French, there may be no business case to build the oil infrastructure. You might be able to persuade me otherwise, but I would like to hear you explain.
Try to persuade you otherwise. So on the question of Trans Mountain being $34 billion, that was absolutely unnecessary. It doesn't need to take $34 billion to build an oil pipeline. And right now, as you may know, some of the shippers are in a legal case with Trans Mountain to figure out what were the cost overruns, what should the shippers be responsible for paying, and what were kind of inappropriate expenses that the government took on in building Trans Mountain. So I think we'll get a better sense of how much that pipeline should have or could have cost. And I think partly going through Prince Rupert or some Northwest port, the idea is to not have to go through Canada's third largest city and all the costs and all the delays that brought with it. But on the question of long-term demand, I think this is the major question, and I feel pretty confident that Canadian heavy oil has a long lifespan in Asia. And I'll give you a few reasons. One is that heavy oil actually produces less than light oil of gasoline and more of petrochemical feedstock, more of jet fuel, more bunker fuel, more diesel. And so even as we do see some electrification of transport, especially in light duty vehicles, you are seeing increases in demand for petrochemical feedstock and jet fuel. And so heavy oil is actually a better mix, a better complement for refineries for what actually the Asian market is looking for. But that being said,
Désolé, je veux pas, juste parce que j'ai pas...
Oh, one moment, and that's only because I don't have much time. Do you have data on what you just said? I know you're extremely efficient, so perhaps you have data on potential market outlets for other kinds of fuel or for fuels other than gasoline.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I'll just say with India, which is obviously where Minister Hodgson was, no one expects that its demand will plateau in the coming decades. It has a lot of runway to get to even, close to the kind of a gasoline consumption, oil consumption we have in North America. So the sense is that even if China demand plateaus, that Southeast Asia will have much more demand for the next coming decades.
Oui, donc je sais pas si...
I don't know whether our other witness would also have an answer today. At present, as I just said, the Energy Board is indicating an increase in demand not only from China, as my colleague explained, but also from India. So is there a way for Canada to facilitate its ability to give to other countries what they absolutely need? Heavy oil has more potential than being used as gasoline. It's interesting to note that countries like Japan, South Korea, and China have refineries able to take in heavy oil and transform it into products that are much more important to their economy. So Canada plays an important role in spite of the geopolitical considerations or in spite of the geography that does present a challenge.
Seconds left for any takers, but we're good. Okay, so for 5 minutes, over to my colleague Jonathan Rowe, who comes from Newfoundland and Labrador, of course, the province for whom oil and gas is the highest percentage of their GDP, even higher than Alberta. So go ahead, Jonathan Rowe.
Well, thank you for having me, and I've got 100 questions, so I'll try to be quick. But we have a refinery in Newfoundland and Labrador, and the Liberal government spent $86 million to retrofit that refinery that once produced gasoline, propane, and diesel, and I believe even jet fuel, now only produces biodiesel. The biofuel market was the U.S., and after Trump made changes to their carbon credit regulations, they have been struggling to find a new market. So I was wondering if Ms. Exner-Pirot do you think that that's wise for a Liberal government to subsidize a retrofit that was dependent on the carbon credit subsidies of foreign nations?
Well, thank you for the question. I have to mention that I did my master's at Memorial University, so lived on Topsail Road. So delighted to hear from you. I guess the proof is in the pudding. The retrofits happened, and it wasn't economic. And there's opportunity costs in terms of putting subsidies and a policy direction into something that isn't economically sustainable. And we're seeing that now. And I do understand, even with that we're trying to make changes to clean fuels regulations, trying to, for example, potentially set up quotas for domestic production. And so there is demand for these biofuels under the CFR, but Canadian competitors had just not been as competitive as foreign exports. So part of it is making sure that we're competitive and not just putting, and Dan can speak to this, not just putting those costs onto the Canadian consumer by first having the clean fuel regulations, having that carbon price, and now also having, further expenses with the quota system. So all of these things, I would say, yes, I would agree with you. Economically, it has at least proven objectively not to be wise.
Yeah. And question for either one of you, perhaps Dan McTagg may want a chance at this, but it's no good to cry over spilt milk. And now this refinery needs to diversify, like you're saying, and they're looking to the EU. Newfoundland place, very east coast of Canada, close to the European markets. But our Prime Minister has been to Europe numerous times, and yet, as far as I know, there has been no deal to get this biodiesel into the EU market immediately. So for the sake of the Newfoundland economy, do you think that should be a priority for Mark Carney and the Liberal government?
Well, yes, and given the cost of diesel today, which of course everyone has noticed is much more expensive than it has been in the past, given the demand, particularly in Europe, but also here in Canada, North America, for ultra sulfur low biofuel diesels, why not? By the way, come by chance, the refinery is something that's near and dear to my heart. In 1998, a report said the federal government should use its power at Petro-Canada to release the restrictive covenant, and guess what? We got the damn thing rolling again. But I say this only because I think there's great opportunities. We're just not looking at those opportunities, or we're not paying a lot of attention to them. Oh, we can do hydro, we can do, other products, but we won't deal with what we have at hand, which is the ability to send diesel to Europe, which last time I checked with the war in Ukraine, is still seeing significant costs, not only for LNG, but for diesel itself, especially with colder weather. And of course, the fuels that are used for jets and other things. The reality is that it's an open market, and maybe we've taken too much of a stance of there's no business case, when in fact there's a huge business case, not just in Europe, but around the world. Last time I checked, that place is certainly amenable to sending that kind of diesel anywhere in the world.
Absolutely. And so I'm just going to transition a bit. We had a German councillor come to Newfoundland and Labrador. They were trying to get natural gas to pivot away from their Russian energy dependence. The Liberal government says, no, we don't want to sell you natural gas. We want to sell you, there's no business case for that, so we want to sell you hydrogen. The thing with that is Canada and Germany jointly pledged $600 million to the project. And CBC articles now saying that they're waiting for more subsidies from either Canadian government or German governments. Does it make sense to subsidize one energy form and rely on foreign German subsidies rather than simply produce more offshore oil and gas that makes a profit, paves roads, improves healthcare, and gives us more geopolitical leverage internationally?
In 38 seconds.
I'll answer that. Obviously, it didn't make sense. And obviously, we're not exporting hydrogen. Obviously, a lot of government was put into that, and it didn't produce the economic development that we were hoping for in Atlantic Canada. And obviously, Germany and other European countries continue to come to Canada and say, we would really like to diversify our LNG import sources. They would like to diversify it off of the Americans towards more Canadian sources. And if we are serious about increasing our alliances, and if we really do want our allies to have energy security, then obviously we should still be focusing on what are the best ways that we can get LNG to those European allies.
Wow, and that's on time. So our next questioner for 5 minutes will be Mr. Danko.
Thank you, Vice Chair.
No, she's chair.
Chair today.
Acting Chair. Doing a great job, by the way. Appreciate the discussion today. A couple of points that I take so far from what we're hearing is that the global demand for Canadian hydrocarbons is strong. in both Asia and Europe, and the need for global diversification from U.S. markets. I think that's pretty clear that that's a priority for the government, and also the inherent nature of Canadian hydrocarbons being low carbon, protecting Canadian workers, protecting the environment, using Canadian materials, Canadian labor, and so on. The benefit domestically. So, in that context, I think most of us agree that there's a need to expand and accelerate the sale of Canadian hydrocarbons abroad. But my first question, Ms. Exner-Pirot, you talked about some of the geopolitical issues currently in the world. And one huge one is, of course, that the U.S. just invaded Venezuela and effectively has control of that country, including the second largest hydrocarbon reserves in the world. So how does that impact Canadian markets and uncertainty broadly in the fossil fuel industry?
Great question. So in the short term, it hasn't impacted too much. Venezuela is ramping up to the production it was having before the blockade. And so while it may seem like there's a ramp up, it's really kind of getting to what was normal a year ago, which is still very far below what it was, let's say, 10 years ago. So obviously Venezuela can and likely will ramp up. But there will be limits to how much it can ramp up. We know in Canada how expensive developing heavy oil assets is, the kind of regulatory certainty that businesses need to do so. And if we may lament, that Canada doesn't have perfect certainty, it's obviously very much worse in Venezuela. And so reserves doesn't equal profitability and it doesn't equal exports. And there's a lot of work to be done there. On the bright side, we've seen some benefit that China is also looking at this situation, seeing Venezuela as a potentially more unreliable source. It had been importing from Venezuela, and that helps to account some of the diversification we've seen here of China demanding more heavy oil, and both China and India looking, I think, to secure more Canadian heavy oil. And I think the important part is that even as for us all to know, even as Canada is looking to diversify its exports, all nations are looking to diversify their oil imports. And because Canada hasn't been on the scene, we haven't been a meaningful exporter of oil. We are a new kid on the block. We are seen as reliable. We are seen as friendly. And those are the kind of attributes you want from your energy importers. And so I think for me, Venezuela shows the whole world why reliability matters and why Canada, by contrast, is a very attractive place to get your hydrocarbons from.
Thank you. Both of you mentioned Asian markets, particularly as an opportunity for Canada sales of hydrocarbons. And Ms. Exner-Pirot, specifically, you talked about opportunities as petrochemical feedstocks. I just want to give you an opportunity to expand on that. So if I take that correctly, that's plastics industry, but not gasoline, diesel, burning hydrocarbons for fuel.
Yes, correct. So that is the segment of the petrochemical, of the hydrocarbon market that is the fastest growing. And you won't, again, where, maybe you could say oil you can displace it with electricity. You can't really displace petrochemicals with another material. They are cheap, they are abundant. And again, heavy oil is well suited for some petrochemicals. And obviously Asia has a very large manufacturing base. Obviously some of Southeast Asia is trying to do more of that. And so you see demand for that growing, even as, gasoline demand in particular may be plateauing in some countries. And I thought I was at a time with Monsieur Simard. So I just, wanted to add one other thing. The world produces and uses about 105 million barrels. And we're competing for those 105 million barrels. But what we also don't appreciate is some countries cannot produce the same level today as they are. They can't in 10 years. They will run down their reserves. United States shale is already peaking. Norway, Mexico, you've already seen that. And so even at a consistent, even if you don't expect any growth in oil demand, there is still going to be a larger portion that Canada can take over from other countries.
Just mentioned the investment side of it, which is that there is real concern that what we're using today is not being replaced or replenished by provable, available reserves. Yes, you have Guyana. Yes, you have Brazil. We can discount the geopolitical strains of what would happen if there's suddenly a regime change in Iran to complement what's happened in Venezuela. But I think the International Energy Agency, not a big friend of oil for its comments for the past several years, has had to finally admit, throw in the towel, that the world is going to need more oil. The question is whether it comes from Canada or some other unsavory country.
Thank you, Mr. McTeague. And I just went over there a bit since I was yapping at the beginning of my colleague's round, so I gave back that time. So so that you could fully answer his question. So going next to Monsieur Simard for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. I think that in your opening statements, you both spoke about the geopolitical situation, the danger of being captive to the American market. And you also talked about how important it was in building infrastructure to de-risk and and if you wanted to have private investment, de-risk that investment, the investment in those infrastructures. I don't think the private sector will invest all that much without public sector intervention. Here's what's bothering me. 88% of production is exported, but 60% of those exports are by U.S. companies. So if we want to protect ourselves from being dependent on the U.S., how would we be ready, or why would we be ready to invest publicly in infrastructure that would benefit the U.S.? The profits go back to U.S. firms who have essentially control over infrastructure that will become strategic. So in the property structure, don't you find it inconsistent to say, let's invest perhaps public money in infrastructure when we know that in the end it's going to serve U.S. interests? Mr. Simard, we've already had the fight about where the investment is to come from. Of course, much of it will come from the U.S., but that money, which leads to the extraction and exportation and export of resources, has overall a positive effect on the economy. So we can ascribe a number to the amounts that will be subsidized by the government, but we can't deny the fact that perhaps 20 or 30 billion a year will come back to the Canadian economy. And federal, provincial, and municipal government revenue will grow through the industry. So does the reality of where the capital comes from prevent us from having benefits? I do know that when it comes to the U.S., one thing I will point out is the absence of Canadian purchasing power because of a weaker Canadian dollar. We're paying 22 cents a litre because we don't have enough interest in our economy. We need to tell everyone that Canada is there and ready to receive investments that will have incredible spin-offs for the vast majority of Canadians.
Very quickly, I just want to say the companies that we're talking about are publicly traded. And so it may be American money, but anyone can have a share in those. And it would be great if more pension plans in Canada were willing to invest. They're getting, money from the California pension plans, some companies, and not for local teacher ones. Anyway, so that money will come. The way I envision the de-risking is with Indigenous loan guarantees. And so that would be just government-backed loans going to Indigenous communities. And I think that is a good way to get some Canadian content and prevent kind of that economic leakage and also build that case for consent.
Thank you. And that is time. And so now we will move on to our third round of questions, which will be me, and the clerk will keep me on track here. So let me start with both of you. I get concerned when people easily use the words we, and we in the royal terms have been used a lot here. I should make it clear that what Conservatives want is for the private sector to be able to build major energy infrastructure, to create jobs, to contribute taxes, royalties, and revenue that provide the programs and services that all Canadians everywhere value, and not that the government ought to subsidize it, except that Canada is in this position because this very government has killed two intergovernmental export pipelines in the last 10 years, so no private sector proponent will go it alone, which is why a provincial government has had to put a group together. TC Energy, who dropped Canada's name from their title, for example, says the U.S. will continue to be where we'll invest because the returns we can earn in the U.S. are significantly more attractive than they are in Canada. To both witnesses, since competitiveness and Canada beating the United States is now more imperative than before, despite the two opportunities that the Liberals killed, during which Canada could have been self-reliant, sovereign, affordable, and independent from the United States, which would have been in service many, many years ago. What do the witnesses have to say about the schedule of policies, bans, mandates, laws, and taxes in Canada's domestic regulatory federal framework that the U.S. has none of? You might want to touch on the oil and gas cap or the Canadian electricity regulations, both mentioned in the MOU, by the way, but on which nothing concrete whatsoever has been done to remove them.
I would simply say the Canadian government has certainly signaled, whether it has realized it or not, that Canada is not open for business, and that our decision that we have to have everything based on net zero and a philosophy that has so far been very, very disruptive, if not damaging, to the Canadian economy, to consumers, notwithstanding the credence with which we attach to it, is sending a signal to the rest of the world that Canada is not a kind of place you want to make business dealings with, because there are so many conditions. Most people simply walk away from it, and the reality is it's not hurting those businesses. It's not hurting those who are sitting on the side saying let's get more subsidies for our net zero. It's actually hurting Canadian consumers. We are seeing oppressive amounts of pressure on Canadian business and consumers, such that we're seeing the effect of low growth in our economy compared to our peers. And we're also seeing a world in which the pursuit of many of these projects and policies, whether that be the one carbon tax we got rid of, the two others, the clean fuel standard and the OBPS, the industrial pricing carbon tax, the narrative around emission caps, the whole idea of electric vehicle mandates, all these things are wonderful in a vacuum, but their effect thus far has been highly damaging and very corrosive to the Canadian way of life, and it has taken away the ability for Canadians to believe that there is going to be a future that indeed is one that will deal with prosperity, as we've seen previous generations bequeath to the next generation.
And those are all policies that the United States, Canada's biggest competitor and now aggressor, does not impose on itself federally to hold themselves back. Yes, Mrs. Exner-Pearl, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add, there is investor interest in Canada right now. We are seen as some place that maybe is doing things different, maybe could go on, but our policies are not matching that rhetoric. There is a lot of anxiety that we're going to miss this window that we've been granted, and there's so much more we could do to unleash this investment. And so, and Dan's mentioned some, but discussion paper from ECCC on OBPS talking about moving to $130 price. That is just chilling everything in this town. On the clean electricity regs, we understand there's a carve out. Don't know what that's going to look like. We don't know what the carbon price is going to be on the end of it. And so it's still a matter of uncertainty where no one wants to invest in any kind of, electricity infrastructure that's natural gas fired, because no one knows what it's going to look like on the other side. So we are still very much in a scenario where there's too much uncertainty. People want to spend, they're looking at Canada, but there's no place for money to stick.
The collapse of investment from Canada into the United States, and a historical anomaly that started in 2015 and got worse ever since. I don't know if, to wrap up, either of you have comments on the importance and the inextricable link between energy and economic and national security, especially in the current geopolitical context. I'd invite you to comment on that to wrap up.
Well, I can start. And, it's obvious from the last several trade delegations what Canada's superpower is. And the way that we're leading new negotiations, that we are expanding trade relationships, and it's leading with oil and gas, and I would say also uranium. And so I think Canadians in general in the last year have become much more aware of how important this is to Canada's standing in the world and to our economy. And I think, politicians have a lot more leeway than they did a year or two ago to make some changes to really let that sector shine. We have so many great resources. We have such great companies. The private sector wants to build and spend. It's not looking for subsidies, and for the very most part, it is just looking for clear rules and a reasonable return on investment. And that can translate into not only, economic growth, but also soft power influence.
Thank you.
Your country,
I'm
country
done.
benefit with everything.
I'm done. Sorry. Yeah, I'm done. So maybe there'll be another opportunity, but let me move my notes quickly because we will go for a full 5 minutes and likely over, since I'm self-aware, for Monsieur Gay.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Exner-Perrault, good to see you again, and thank you for coming to the committee. I sit here and I'm baffled because I think the word that the Prime Minister uses is pragmatic, and I feel that I'm hearing non-pragmatic position because, particularly when I sit in the House of Commons, because in the past government there was all these regulation, and I hear you saying that everything was over-regulated, making nothing happening, and previous conservative government got nothing done because they had zero regulation, and it ended up in court. It ended up with the First Nation.
Let's just stick to facts and not absolutely
ended up with
lie
the
like
first,
that.
Madam Chair. It's my time to
Yeah, I am the
editorial.
chair, but stick with facts.
So there was a lot of contest in the courts. There was a lot of protests from the First Nation. So in a world of complete deregulation and no consultation, we can't get anything done. In a context of over-regulation, we can't get anything done. What are you suggesting as a middle ground, as a pragmatic ground? Because I do agree that we are resource rich, and I do agree the purpose of this study is how can we get more exported. So what is that middle ground that the government should be looking for?
Great question. I will say on LNG, we're finding something of a middle ground, and I would say it's been very important. We have great resources, we know that. We have a great market to get into. But for both the BC and the federal government to say, we actually want this, to go to Asia and say, yes, we want this LNG, we will allow it to proceed. And that's been very helpful. I think obviously an interprovincial oil pipeline is the most contentious of things that we're discussing, and that's still very difficult. So on the middle ground, make it clear, we follow the duty to consult Section 35 in Canada. Adding DRIPA, adding UNDRIP on top of that has muddied the waters. I think that's very clear. But the courts have been pretty consistent on saying we need it. We have a duty to consult and accommodate. It's not a veto. We don't require consent, but we will do our very best operating in good faith as the Crown to meet any of your objectives and to accommodate and mitigate kind of the impacts on treaty and Aboriginal rights. So we know what it is, but sometimes but it's still muddy, I think, in how we communicate that. And on the regulations, what I'm, really is certainty. Again, with ECCC, and I'd say very good rhetoric coming from the government, but ECCC is still doing things that seem to contradict both the MOU and the signals that we're going to China and India. So saying that we're going to have another revamp of the OBPS and trying to increase the price to match the headline price, undermining the markets that we've already had, I think is very unhelpful. The methane regs, proposing regulations that are different from what the MOU, the time frame even that the MOU with Alberta just put forward. Clean fuel regulations, again, where you put in regulations 2 years ago, they've already shown to not be working. And so now we have to make new amendments to those. It's so difficult for, as you know, for the private sector to look at a case and make the business case and figure out what your return is going to be when the regulations are changing so much. And so desperately in this country, we need consensus on energy policy. I think we're closer than we have been, but on the policy side and some of the policies that, pre-existed this current government are still there as a fly in the ointment.
And what do you think, Ms. Exner-Perrault, of the MOU signed between the federal government and Premier Danielle Smith of Alberta?
I thought it was a very good MOU. But again, as you would know, some of the elements have not been formalized. So we know there's a carve-out for the clean electricity regulations, but we don't know what that looks like. We know that a lot of this hinges on some April 1st carbon price, industrial carbon price agreement. but we don't know what that's going to be. You don't know when we're trying to reach $130. You don't know if tier is going to be respected or if there's going to be a carbon tax replacement, as the discussion paper seems to make clear. So these are all things. I think the mood was buoyant in Calgary in November. And there's been, and also the green taxonomy introduced. So several things have happened since the MOU was signed on the policy front, mostly from ECCC, that is again muddying the waters and making it unclear for investment what they should be doing.
But if I can rephrase what you just said, if all of these becomes clear, which I think was the intent of the MOU, this would actually provide certainty for the investor. Is that correct?
I think if the MOU is implemented with reasonable carbon pricing, that yes, that will be a very improved situation, and that we'll get to FID on Silicens and PRGT, and hopefully to an oil pipeline as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monsieur Gay, and thank you to the witnesses. Of course, it sounds very clear that there's been 11 years of uncertainty that started in 2016, and today in 2026, there's still a lack of certainty. So thank you for a fantastic meeting and a discussion that is absolutely critical to Canada's economy and to our international standing in the world, since this sector underpins the entire Canadian economy.
Madam Chair?
So,
Madam Chair?
Do we have, yeah.
Yes, I don't know if it's proper time, but I would like to present a motion at the next meeting and present it in ad hoc. In camera, I should say, if agreed.
Yes, I think there's agreement. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Millett. Anything for any other colleagues? No? Except giving me shit for my editorial comments, which is fair game. Okay. Well, thank you, colleagues, to our witnesses again. I certainly do encourage you to follow up with written input if there's anything that you didn't get to, because that is the only way in which MPs can include your extra feedback in the overall committee's report or in a supplementary report should somebody decide to do that. So that is all the time we have today with this panel, and I do just want to thank the witnesses again for being here. Our next meeting will be on Thursday, February 5th, where we will continue the current study. So if everybody agrees.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you. So if everybody agrees, meeting adjourned.